good afternoon or good morning or good evening from wherever you're chiming in. Welcome to the last COGEN World Coalition, CWC webinar of the year. And I'm very pleased that this is our third edition of the Global Cogeneration Market Report launch. So I'm very happy to have Simon Minett with us, the Managing Director from Challoch Energy, and we have our President, Tom Smith, with us as well. A few practical points. So everyone listening, we are recording the session, so we will also make everything available online. The recording of the video as well as the presentation that will be shared by Simon in a few moments. So not to worry. And so if you miss part of the webinar or you have colleagues that might be interested, it'll be available on the CWC website in a few days. There will be a Q&A segment at the end of the webinar, so please do use the Q&A function in the Zoom platform. Type in your questions there, and we'll try to address them at the end of the meeting, and perhaps even as we talk and present, it'll be an opportunity for us also to answer them in writing if they're short enough. Without saying too much further, I'd like to introduce Tom Smith, our president, to give a few welcome and introductory remarks for this all-important launch report for the Cogeneration Market Report. Tom,
well, Hans, thank you very much, and I really appreciate you setting these meetings up really early Chicago time, so it gets me up and motivated even more than I am usually. So thank you for that. In advance, Simon, thank you for all the hard work and putting this report together. It's as the COGEN community, it's greatly appreciated. Just a couple updates. I know the report that Simon's going to put together or is going to present and is put together, even though it is current as we have the data, it doesn't include a lot of some really good tailwinds that we've had in the industry, specifically here in the United States, where I happen to be the president of the Combined Heat and Power Alliance as well. We've had a sort of a banner year for COGEN this year because of incentives that were put in place that incentivize COGEN on par with renewable technologies like wind and solar. The reason our administration did that is the massive sustainability benefits that COGEN can, immediately provide when you put it into the grid based on our efficiency. So, that's been a really, really good tailwind. The other thing that we're starting to see, which personally makes me very excited for the future of the industry. Everybody that listens to TV hears about the revolution with AI and all the great things that are happening in the data center world. Unfortunately, or fortunately for us, it requires a lot of energy to do all the computing that's needed in AI, and about 40 to 50% of the actual energy used is going in the cooling. So when you look at COGEN with an absorption chiller and what some people call trigen, we're able to efficiently produce energy and chill water, which is being adopted by the data center community. So we're very hopeful that that takes off along with our traditional markets. We're looking for a bright future for COGEN, and organizations like the CWC, the CHPA, and others can't really survive and do all the great things that we do without the support of the members and getting new members. So if any of you are interested in joining, Hans would be very, very happy, I'm sure, to take your information and get that out. So with that said, I'd like to turn it over to Simon, and he'll give us the update report. Thank you, Simon.
Thanks, Tom. Just share my screen. Is that visible to people now?
Your screen is visible.
Oh, picked the wrong thing up, I think. Apologies for that.
There you go, Simon.
Okay, good. Okay,
You
so
may want to expand it out a little bit if you can.
that better?
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
about as big as it's going to go. So
Okay.
okay, so this is the Global CHP or Cogeneration Market Overview. It's the third edition of this, and it's almost exactly a year since we did the last one of these. So I'm Simon Minett. I'm Managing Director of Challoch Energy, and I've been in the CHP world for longer than I care to remember, 35 years, I think it is now. So I'm quite long in the tooth. Okay, so the structure of this is we'll look at how we did it quickly, then look at an overview of the world, and then pick the regional markets. So Europe, I'm going to skip Russia. We included it for completeness, but I'm going to skip it for now. The Americas, Asia, a little bit on Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. And then I don't want to spend any time on the last two bits, which are part of the report, so everybody will get that. But I do want to look at some of the trends that we're seeing. This is an update from last year. So it's desk research. We used IEA data, so the International Energy Agency data, the European Union's Eurostat data, and some data from national statistical offices where that is available. And then we used other sources, so from COGEN Europe, from Global Energy Monitor, the Digest of United Kingdom Energy Statistics, etc. And there was a survey done for different countries who are members of CWC. So there's all that forms the background. The analysis looks at the period between 2011 and 2021, with the exception of the EU, where we've got 2022 data. So we've included a slide on 2022. But the 2022 data from the IEA was just not complete enough to really draw any conclusions. So we stick with 2021, and that's 1 year on from last year. So I said almost exactly the same thing last year, that the data for last year was 2020. It would be nice if it was a bit more close to home, but it isn't. So turning to the world, what you can see here is there's nearly 4.5 terawatt hours of electricity produced by CHP plants across the world. There's been an increase in the capacity of cogen, and also an increase in the electrical output of cogen. So electrical output's up in the last decade by 757 terawatt hours. And the heat output also went up by about 3,000 terawatt hours. And you can see that the green lines, which is the heat output, and the red bars, which is the electrical output, have shown modest growth over that decade. But you can see overall that the share of cogen in global power markets has declined slightly. It's down by about 1%. And that, I think, reflects not the fact that cogen's not doing reasonably well, but in fact that power markets are growing faster than cogen output is. And as Tom has already alluded to, part of that is starting to be driven really by the data center sector. And more about that a bit later on. In terms of fuel mix, it's still dominated by coal with 61%, and natural gas with 31%, and then there's a mixture of other fuels, a reasonable amount of them from biofuels and waste, 6.5% from biofuels and waste fuels. Coal is declining and continues to decline, but it's declining from a very high base, of course. and that's partly driven by the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions globally. But coal is still a very dominant fuel in a number of important markets for cogen across, especially in Asia. You do see a growth in renewables, considerable growth in Europe in that area, and increasingly elsewhere, but it's still relatively minor in the total scheme of things. And natural gas is still the fuel of choice for modern cogen plants, where it's based on gas turbines and gas engines. Okay, so I'm going to then go through country by country or region by region. So this is Europe. It's looking at the 10-year trend from 2011 to 2021. Pretty stable market in Europe. Not much change over that decade, really, to be honest. 1.4 terawatt hour, 1,400 terawatt hours of electricity produced, and a reasonable amount of heat, 5,000 terawatt hours of heat produced across that market, dominated by two main sectors, district heating and industry, with some smaller stuff in other sectors. As you can see from the fuel mix here, natural gas is the dominant fuel in the European region, with 60%. Coal is 26%, mostly in the eastern part of Europe. That's still quite a strong fuel for cogen plants. And you see that renewables make up about 11% of the total market, and that one is growing, but it's growing slowly. As I promised, Eurostat's a bit faster than the IEA. Eurostat has produced its statistics for 2022, so this looks at 2022. I want to make a comment of caution. The data sets that Eurostat use and the data sets that IEA use are not compatible. So for the main survey, we used IEA data because it covers more of the planet. But for Europe, we use a mix of both. So the fuel mix here is a bit different, and the capacity is different. And the reason for that is the way that CHP plants are classified by the European Union, where it's only the part of a plant that is operated in a cogeneration cycle that is counted. So if you have a large power plant with a bit of a heat offtake, you only count the bit that's relevant to the heat offtake and not the whole power plant output. IEA statistics do it a little bit different and count more of that, which is why there's a difference between the two. What you can see in Europe is the market's dominated by 5 or 6 countries, so Finland, France, Spain, Netherlands, Poland, Italy, and Germany, and then a tail of smaller markets. The Northern European countries, so Finland, Sweden, Denmark, it's mostly district heating, which dominates here, and in Germany it's a mixture of district heating and industry. In the Netherlands, it's mostly industrial CHP that is used. Also in this, the fuel mix is more skewed towards renewables, so 30% of fuel comes from renewables in cogen mode, and that reflects the fact that the difference in the statistical data sets effectively, that this is true CHP rather than CHP, which is also part of a larger power plant project. Natural gas still effectively almost half the fuel, and tiny little bits for nuclear and other products. picking a couple of countries. So what we've done here is we've looked at the biggest markets in Europe. Apologies, my dog is deciding to bark at a postman, I think. So looking at Germany, Germany's got 125 terawatt hours of electricity from cogen plants. It's a mixture of natural gas, coal, and biofuels. Coal's making up 13%, biofuels 28%, and natural gas 57% of fuel into cogen plants. You can see also that Germany is showing an increased share in CHP, up to 20% of the total power output. And policy-wise, there's a continued push for CHP within the German market. Second market to look at is Italy. 102 terawatt hours of electricity produced by Italian cogen plants. The vast majority of that is natural gas fired, with 81%. Much smaller share of renewables and a little bit of other fossil fuel products, so coal and oil. And you can see that the Italian market has sort of broadly been stable. There was a dip in 2014 in output, and it's climbed back up, and it's sitting at around about 35% of the Italian electricity market comes from cogen plants. This is mostly industry in Italy, because the climate is such that district heating works in the north but not in the south of the country, but in industry is the dominant sector. The Netherlands and Poland. So the Netherlands, again, mostly natural gas with a reasonable share of biofuels in there. The Netherlands, however, has seen a decline in the role of cogen. It used to be the cogen king of Europe back in the around about the year 2000, with about 45–50% of all electricity coming from cogen plants. Share has been dropping. The capacity has been dropping, and there's very strong competition from renewable fuels, wind and solar in the Netherlands. And again, the dominant sector for the Netherlands is the industrial sector. And then finally, for Europe, Poland. Poland's a market in transition. Very, very strong role of coal in the market, with a lot of political pressure to move out of coal into other fuels. Most of the market is district heating, or a large proportion of it's district heating, and the share has been fairly stable. And there are reasonably strong policies in Poland to change from coal out to other fuels. I think it will probably go to natural gas first, and then on to renewables at a later date. Electricity produced from the Polish market is around 150 terawatt hours. Okay, coming out of the EU to the United Kingdom, of course, for those of you who have longer memories, the UK used to be part of the EU until a few years ago, when it decided it was cut its own way in the world. Statistics for the UK show a modest decline in heat output from cogen plants, and a fairly stable market over the last decade for electricity production. So there has been some plants that have come out of service in that market, and there's a lot of pressure on some of the other plants to come out, but we're not starting to see that dramatically yet. Natural gas is the dominant fuel, with 74% of the share, and then a reasonable amount of biogas and biomass and waste fuels in there, making up about a quarter of the fuel mix, and then a little bit for petroleum products. said, I pass on the Russian Federation this year. Turning now to the Americas. So this is both North and South America. 418 terawatt hours of electricity produced by cogen plants across the region, dominated by the United States, as we'll see in a moment. The electricity production in the US has been relatively stable, somewhere between 6 and 7% over the last decade. And as Tom says, I think when we look at this in the next year or two, we'll see an uptick in that caused by the policy regime in the US, and also driven by data center growth. But we're not yet seeing that in these statistics. So 2021 was a little bit too early to see that. Across the region, natural gas is the dominant fuel, with 65%, and biofuels and waste having about a quarter of that. A lot of that biofuel comes from South America, so Brazil and places where you've got a lot of sugarcane and things like that. Looking at the US market has been really quite up and down as a share of total electricity production. Not quite sure why that is, and maybe Tom, you can add a little bit of color to that after I've been speaking. In terms of heat output, it's fairly stable, but again, a bit up and down. Electricity production is quite stable over the decade. So the share is one of those things. It may be a statistical anomaly, but it seems to be a little bit too flexible. It could also be the fact that just looking at the scale on the side, we've actually put quite a small scale there, so we might be exaggerating the trend. In fuel mix, natural gas is the dominant fuel. 2/3 of all fuel into cogen plants is from natural gas. 12% from biofuels and 16% from coal. I guess we'd probably see coal decline a little bit, and maybe biofuels grow a bit, but it's likely that natural gas will remain the dominant fuel in this market for a period of time. And I would suspect that when we see next year or the year after, natural gas would probably have a slightly bigger share of the total fuel mix. Turning to Canada, it's a much smaller market than the US, with only 11 terawatt hours. It's almost all natural gas. A lot of that is associated with its extraction industries, with a little bit of district heating in there for some of the big towns. The share of electricity or the production of electricity has seen a decline and then a rise again. So CHP is growing again a little bit in share of total electricity production, and the heat has wobbled up and down quite a lot, and it's not quite clear why that is. And we didn't find any evidence why there was such a change in the heat demand between, say, 2013 and 2017, and then a growth thereafter. So Brazil, the largest cogen market in South America, 86 terawatt hours of electricity production from cogen plants, dominated by biofuels, so mostly sugarcane, but clearly some other biofuels go into that, and 22% of cogen fueled by natural gas, and that's mostly in the Sao Paulo region of Brazil, and that's mostly industrial. You'll notice here that there are no statistics at all for the heat output from Brazilian cogen plants. So that's a gap in the data, and it's difficult to know exactly how much. as a lot of it is for industry, you'd expect the heat demand to be reasonable. And you can see that over the last decade, the share of CHP and the electrical output from CHP plants has grown steadily between 2011 and 2020, showing then a slight decline in 2021. Okay, turning now to the Asian market. It's the largest market of the world, dominated by China, as we'll see in a bit. 2,550 terawatt hours of electricity produced by CHP plants in Asia, seen a steady rise in both the heat output and a modest rise in the electrical output of cogen plants, and as a total share of electricity, a slight decline over the decade, probably reflecting the growth of the economies of these countries outstripping the sort of the more energy efficient plants being put in. This region is dominated by coal, and coal is dominant in China and India, the two biggest markets in Asia, with Japan being mostly natural gas. So this is China. As you can see, China's about 80% of the total Asian market, so massive share of the total. Mostly coal. 96% of all fuel going into cogen plants at the moment, or at least in 2021, was coal. I would expect to see a shift in that over the next few years, where coal will decline a bit, but we don't see any renewables in there at the moment, and natural gas has a very small share, only 4% of the total. The electricity production has grown from around about 7% to 10% it's grown from about 1,500 terawatt hours to around about 2,200 terawatt hours in that decade. But the share of total power has declined from 30-odd% down to 26% in that decade, reflecting the fact that more and more power is being put onto the system from non-cogen plants in China. India's fraction of that market, huge potential in India for cogen, but still a very young market in some ways. All the fuel mix in India comes from biofuels and waste, which frankly I just don't believe the statistics completely there, to be honest. I would think there must be some coal in there somewhere, because coal is quite a dominant fuel in the power sector, and I can't believe that there isn't coal used in some industrial sectors. But this is what the statistics say, so it's difficult to know. You'll also see that there's no statistical data for heat in India, but the share of electricity from cogen and the total output of electricity from cogen has risen steadily over the decade, reaching 27 terawatt hours in 2021 and 1.6% of the total market. It's coming from a low base, so there's lots of growth potential in India. One would suspect it depends on regulations. Last couple of regions. Firstly, Africa. Again, a tiny market across Africa, dominated by both Southern Africa and Northern Africa, and not much in the middle, to be honest. Natural gas and biofuels share the fuel almost 50-50, and the total share of African electricity that comes from cogen plants is 0.15%, so it's tiny compared to the total output, to be honest. And again, no data in this market on heat. Finally, Australia, and I think there's one on not on New Zealand in a moment. Australia, 17 terawatt hours of electricity from cogen plants, mostly natural gas with some biofuels and some coal, but you know, natural gas makes up 2/3, sorry, three quarters of the total. And the amount of CHP electricity has grown by about 20% over the decade, and the share has grown from 5 to 6% in that period. Still a relatively small market compared to the total electricity production in the country. And last but not least, New Zealand. New Zealand's a tiny market, really, 2.3 terawatt hours of electricity, and showing a decline over the decade from a high of 6% share to down to 5% now, and a decline also in electricity output, and heat's fairly stable. And this is a good example of where the statistics probably could do with more work, because you'd expect the heat output to be greater than the electrical output, given the types of plants that are used. So there's a lot of non-CHP electricity being recorded as CHP electricity in these statistics. Fuels here, it's a third, give or take, between biofuels, well, renewable fuels, coal, and natural gas. Natural gas getting a bit more than a third, but it's actually 40%. Okay, this is my last slide. I've got a couple of slides afterwards on waste heat and things, which I think are just there really for the report. I included this slide last year. I haven't changed too many words on this slide from the report last year, as not much has changed. You know, current situation is Asia is still the largest market. Europe and North America have developed stagnating CHP markets, but I think we'll see a change next year when we look at North America, at least the US, with the IRA incentives. Technologies, both gas and steam turbines, are the two main technologies in the market, and partly because they're larger than the other technologies as well. They dominate, and as we've seen, coal is still a significant fuel in that market, distorted, of course, in terms of total share by what goes on in China, where coal is a very, very dominant fuel, and biofuels still marginal globally, but quite important in some markets, you know, in different regions. Looking at the forecast, so growth will come in Asia, in India especially, I think. You'll see some growth in South America. And then I haven't changed this, I left it in deliberately, that Europe and North America will see the role of CHP diminish. In Europe, I think that's still a trend. In North America, I think the jury is out on that this year, but it's a question of the data center market. So if I move then to the right side and the end users, data centers are driving demand for gas turbines and gas engines. Historically, data centers have used grid power as the principal power, and then backup diesel generators to give the 6 or 7 nines of reliability that they need for their electricity demands. Increasingly, as data centers get bigger and bigger, the grid can't cope. And if you were on the webinar we did about a month ago on data centers, you'll have got that. And if you weren't on that and you want to see the report, then please reach out to CWC to get it. The bigger the data center, the harder the grid it is to bring the grid to it. So we're looking at 200 megawatt data center up to maybe 1 gigawatt, and there's even a 4 gigawatt data center being discussed at the moment. It's impossible for grids to do that straight away. It may take time to do the strengthening. So prime power goes into those. At the moment, most of that is coming from non-CHP sources, so some pure open cycle gas turbines or gas engines. We start to see some nuclear in there with steam turbines as well being discussed. I expect that to change, but we're not seeing that en masse. And I just want to give you one statistic that crossed my desk this morning while I was preparing for today. Power Engineering, which is a journal produced by Clarion, had a headline today that GE has tabled 9 gigawatts of gas turbines in the last month for data centers, which is just an extraordinary number, to be perfectly honest. So data centers is the biggest growth market by a long, long way across the whole planet for on-site power. And I think the challenge for the CHP industry is to make sure that CHP, and it's not just pure power with a very low efficiency of production. On that, ladies and gentlemen, I will stop and happy to take some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you for the very comprehensive presentation again. Some interesting trends, certainly a lot of interest in data centers. And to your point about the CWC report, so if anyone's interested, it is available on the CWC website. So all you have to do is go to the website and you'll find the report as well as the webinar and other complementary information coming from the CWC members in terms of data centers. There was actually only one question, Simon, in the Q&A function, and that was more of a comment in relation to the age of the data, which I already answered. Basically, that the data that we use from the IEA is the latest available information that was published in 2021, and for Eurostat it's 2022, and that's just because the offices that collect the information have to go from one country to another, collect the data, make sure that it makes sense, that it's homogeneous, and then they publish it. So there's always a slight delay, and as frustrating as it may be, that's the situation, but we like to use the official data. So that's where we continue to work with the IEA and Eurostat. If you want more up-to-date information, CWC does organize specific webinars about different countries. I believe this year we had 2 or 3 different webinars focusing on, if I remember correctly, Japan, Germany, and one other country that has escaped me, but we will continue to do that.
Czech Republic, I think.
Czech Republic. Yeah. So we will continue to do that. So that way everyone can have also a glimpse at the most recent and most up-to-date information available to us. I have one question for you, Simon, and it goes along the lines of data centers and AI. Do you suspect that a large amount of the growth in Asia is also linked to data centers, or at least the potential for further growth in Asia is linked to data centers? Because, as you said, CHP in data centers is negligible at the moment, but there is a lot of potential, obviously, in the future.
Yeah, I think it depends. In data center locations depend on where the cable capacity is. It's a bit like the initial days of combined cycle gas turbine power plants being built. Basically, what utilities did was worked out where the gas grid crossed the electricity grid, and that's where we're going to put a power plant. There's a bit of that going on with data centers at the moment, land grabs around where the cable capacity is there. You see quite a lot of talk about data centers going into North Africa and the Middle East, partly driven by cheaper fuels potentially, and large availabilities of natural gas. You see it in North America. You see some in Europe, and then you're starting to see things in Japan and China, but less so in places like India. And India's one of those markets that at some point might just explode, and you'll suddenly get enormous amount going on in India, because it's sort of like sitting there a long way behind everybody else in terms of the role of these sorts of technologies, but the population is huge. So you'd expect at some point it will start to catch up. And if I go back 20 years and look at where we were with China, you sort of saw that happen in China. So maybe that changes. I think it will also depend on the availability of the fuels that can go into it. So, at the moment, natural gas is the fuel of choice for prime power in data centers, with some nods towards things like hydrogenated vegetable oils, HVO, in some markets. Coal doesn't lend itself very much to data centers. Existing power plants might, if you can site them next door. Nuclear takes time to build unless you can go next to a nuclear plant. So it's really going to be natural gas, and that will limit where data centers go because of fuel. So that might limit India because the availability of natural gas in India is less than in some countries. But that's why I think the Middle East and North Africa might see quite a lot there. So I think it will depend. But it's a mega trend in the market. It's the biggest thing that's happened in the last 5 years, to be honest, in the electricity market, bigger than greening up the electricity market and decarbonisation and things like that. It's much bigger than that globally.
All right, thank you for that. We still have time to take questions, so if you have any burning questions, use the Q&A function.
Hey Simon, I got a quick question for you. I know before we started the webinar, we were sort of talking about how the amount of kilowatt hours produced by CHP has been going up because of the capacity factor and our high efficiencies. Do you see that being more of a trend too, as people are focusing on sustainability, and even, we're going to see higher outputs in kilowatt hours and thermal in our CHP plants based on that?
I think the answer to that, Tom, is it depends. So I think when you're in Europe, then we might see the capacity factors go down a bit because of flexibility requirements to meet with, a large portfolio of wind and solar plants in the system. So what was traditionally a baseload generator for industry is going to operate more flexibly in that process, and district heating markets may have a mix of technologies in there. So some heat pumps and some waste heat and cogen plants, and they'll operate depending on the market. In other places, then I think that capacity factor will go up. North America is one of those markets, I think, where there's a big growth in the sector anyway, in the economy, which is driving growth, and a lot of the existing infrastructure is rather old and weak. So cogen makes a lot of sense there, but there will be parts of North America where that also doesn't apply. So thinking maybe of the Northeast states and California, where you might get slightly different drivers. And then in other markets where power is still relatively short supply, then yes, I can see cogen having high capacity factors in those markets, especially when it's driven on the back of industrial output, which is a large amount of South America or South Africa or Australia.
Yeah, and maybe a lead-on question to that, Simon, is where the world is focusing on greening, our emissions, and CHP obviously can, meet some of or lower some of the emissions quite a bit, but future-proofing CHP with fuels like hydrogen that are coming into the market. How do you see that? Because if people are producing hydrogen, you'd think you'd want to use it as efficiently as you possibly could. Do you see that being a sort of a, let's call it a tailwind for our industry as well?
Yes, but not yet. So if I look at Europe first, with the growth of renewables in the system, we get overcapacity at times in renewables, and then curtailment of wind, especially wind and solar. So hydrogen production starts to become a sensible option there. So hydrogen going into the system, a lot of industry is looking at hydrogen as well as electrification, but electrification can probably only go so far in industry. So I see Europe perhaps being the first adopter. I could be wrong in that process. And as we move towards 2040, 2050, where most countries have signed up to some sort of massive reduction in carbon emissions, hydrogen has to have a role in that process. Carbon capture and storage maybe as well, but hydrogen does come through that process, and especially once you get to high penetrations of renewables, 50% of renewables in the electricity market, and that's wind and solar. You start to get to a point where there are times in the day when you're producing far too much and you have to curtail. So that is a natural home for producing hydrogen at that point. Whether that occurs in China and India and places, I'm not so sure. I can also see perhaps it occurring in Japan, where it's mostly an imported fuel market, Japan, where fuels are used. But if you start to create a large renewable base there, then hydrogen might be used to replace natural gas in that market. The first hydrogen cogen plant that was put in of any scale was in the Kobe port area a few years ago. So yeah, I know they led the world. It doesn't mean they're going to continue to lead the world in that process, but I do see hydrogen being an important driver in the next decade. But now it's at a very small base.
Thank you.
All right, then. Well, let me take the pleasure of wrapping things up. So thank you again to Simon Minett from Challoch Energy for the report. As I mentioned before, everything will be made available on the website in a few days, including the recording, as well as a copy of the report. So look out for that. And thank you, of course, to our president for joining for the introductory remarks and the questions. So we always appreciate that. So this will be our last webinar of 2024, but we will be coming back in force in 2025 with more webinars. I mentioned already, we will continue to deep dive into specific countries to look at CHP, what is the regulatory regime, what sort of support incentives are in place, what does the market look like, where is it going, what kind of fuels are being used, et cetera, technologies. So we will continue to do that and at least have 3 or 4 specific webinars focused on different countries around the world. So do look out for that. We are planning to continue to look at data centers and maybe going into it more specifically and the role of CHP. So look out for that as well. We hope to get that done in the second half of next year. We'll also be looking at different technologies, may they be engines, gas turbines, etc., micro CHP, fuel cells, and their role in different sectors. May it be industrial purposes, may it be for district heating purposes, buildings. We will have more sort of segmental webinars looking at different technologies and their applications. So look out for that as well. So without further ado, thank you so much for your attention and your participation, and we look to continue to welcome you to our webinars in 2025. In the meantime, I wish you all a pleasant holiday period, and looking forward to seeing you all in early 2025. So thank you again, and that'll be the end of the webinar.